No, I think I agree. I mean, certainly suffering is real. I mean, sometimes misery and suffering and pain are caused by some story in which people believed, but it doesn't matter. The suffering itself is real. I would say that if you really want to explore reality, the best place to start is with suffering because it's the most real thing in the world. With happiness, it's very difficult to tell whether, many times people tell themselves, oh, I'm very happy. And actually, they are not. They are deluding themselves. And that's difficult. But with suffering, it's usually much easier to know. So, yes, this is definitely real.
Although even there, suffering is amenable to being reconstrued based on the conceptual frame you put around it. So if you've ever engaged in a very intense athletic event, say, or people who have trained to be the kinds of elite soldiers you just referenced, Navy SEALs, they go through something like a physical hell. If you imposed that training on some unsuspecting person against his will, you would be guilty of torturing them, right? And yet people willingly do this because they have a goal that they're in touch with and they want to get to the other side of this physical ordeal. It's not viewed as torture. And in fact, when they look back on it, it's some of the most positive experience they've had, even though if you could sample their moment to moment experience while enduring it, they were in agony. As you must know from meditation, there are experiences of extraordinarily intense sensation when you're sitting for hours with, a pain in your knee, for instance, where it becomes genuinely difficult to tell whether what you're experiencing is agony or ecstasy. It's sheer intensity. If you have a true equanimity of attention at that moment, the difference almost doesn't matter. So there is something paradoxical even about suffering when you really pay attention to it.
Yes, definitely. Suffering, it's also a very complex matter. I would say that suffering certainly isn't pain. Suffering is generated by the mind. It's the reaction of the mind that is suffering.
Right.
It's not the objective condition in the outside world. It's not even the sensations in the body. In the body, you can have pain, you can have pressure, you can have heat. This is not suffering. The suffering is the reaction of the mind. The mind, for some reason, it doesn't matter what the reason is, for some reason, the mind doesn't like something and reacts by generating suffering, by trying to push it away, by hating this thing.
Yeah.
And this is the suffering, the reaction of the mind. And it's not easy to see it, of course, but and therefore also just as happiness is not obvious what it is, so also is suffering. It's not obvious what it is, but in the end, this is the most real thing in the world.
Well, that's a fascinating claim because given that it's vulnerable to inspection in the way that we've described, given that is an illusory component to suffering. In fact, once you realize that it is at the level of a story as opposed to at the level of the raw, painful sensation, it is somewhat paradoxical to say that it's the most real thing in the world. It's certainly real in terms of its motivational consequences. People are again, going to war or just initiating the great sweeps of history based on what they want out of life and being driven by the goad of suffering in one direction or another. But the person who is just told that, the pile of paper in his bag worth $1 million just went up in flames and he begins to suffer over it, it's odd to describe that principle as the most real thing in the world.
For that person, at that moment, the intense misery he experiences, this is the most real thing in the world. Now, the cause of the misery may be an illusion or several illusions stuck one on top of the other.
Mm,
But actual experience for that person at that moment, this is the reality for him.
yeah.
And in Western philosophy, you see it very, very clearly, I think, with Descartes, that he goes on this expedition of doubting the whole world. And how do I know, like the Matrix, how do I know that the trees and then the sky and the other people, how do I know that anything really exists? And how can I trust anything? And in the end, he comes to the point when the only thing he can trust is his own momentary mental state. His very doubt, the thought, is the only thing he can trust. And then, of course, he makes a terrible mistake. He says, I think, therefore I am.
Mm.
And he invents the I out of nowhere. He should have said, there is thought, therefore there is thought. But no, because I think of the Christian tradition, he couldn't get rid of it. And he invented a self, an I, that thinks the thought. And once he began inventing, very quickly, he also somehow managed to invent God and bring him into the picture and so forth and so on.
Yeah.
But if you go with the radical doubt of Descartes, then you see that the only thing you cannot doubt is your own momentary mental state right now. In this sense, this is the most real thing in the world.
The phrase I've used on this podcast and elsewhere is that consciousness is the one thing in this universe that cannot be an illusion. Because
Exactly.
even if you're radically confused about everything, even if you're not at the base layer of reality and you're in the hard drive of some alien supercomputer and confused about everything, this is the modern equivalent of being a brain in a vat, you still can't deny that something seems to be happening. And that seeming is as much a demonstration of consciousness as anything else.
Yeah, exactly.
So